The money I sent was for us. For 6 years, I worked in the shadows of a foreign city, washing dishes, scrubbing floors, folding bed sheets in hotel rooms where strangers came and left without a name. Every night, I counted coins. Every month, I sent everything home. And every time I pressed send, I imagined the life we were building. Not his life, not her life, ours. My name is Mai. I'm 33 years old, and I used to believe that love, when wrapped in sacrifice, could survive anything. When I left for Taiwan in 2017, I kissed my husband goodbye at the airport. He held our 2-year-old son in his arms. Tears clung to his lashes as he said, "Go, I'll wait, I promise." I clung to those words like prayer beads. I whispered them to myself every night when I was too tired to cry and too numb to sleep. Go, I'll wait. I worked through illness, typhoons, overtime, and even a broken wrist that never fully healed right. Because I believed he was waiting. Every remittance had a note. Buy the cement for the front yard. Fix the leaking roof. Pay for Tuan's school. I imagined my son's face lighting up as he learned new words. I imagined my husband showing him the photos I sent. I imagined their voices on the other side of the world calling me hero. But all I ever got in return were one-line messages. Money received, thanks. Busy, we'll call later. Kid, fine, you take care. I told myself he wasn't good with words, that he was tired too, that men just didn't know how to say what they feel. What I didn't know was that he was learning to say those words to someone else. I lived in a room no bigger than a closet, shared with 3 other women. We all had our own heartbreaks. We shared instant noodles, photos of our children, and midnight stories about dreams we no longer dared speak aloud. But I had hope. And that made me lucky, didn't it? That's what I told myself the day I finally bought a plane ticket home. 1 month of unpaid leave, a small suitcase, a heart bursting with pride. I even wrapped a little gold bracelet I bought for Tuan with my last tip. It had his name engraved. I imagined him running into my arms at the gate. I imagined my husband's eyes filling with tears as he saw how much weight I had lost just to keep our family afloat. I imagined warmth and home. Instead, I came home to silence. The house I had poured my soul into didn't have my name on the door. The yard I paid to cement was filled with potted plants I didn't recognize. The woman who opened the gate wasn't me. She was young, pretty, wearing my husband's shirt. She looked surprised, uncomfortable. Not because I was a stranger, but because I wasn't supposed to be here. I stood frozen as my son peeked out from behind her. He looked taller, thinner, his face unsure. He didn't run to me. He didn't shout, "Mom," like I had played over and over in my dreams. He looked at me like I was someone he'd once known, in a story someone told him long ago. And then my husband walked out. Fong. He stood at the doorway in slippers in a silence thicker than the heat. His face was unreadable, but his hands, they were clenched. "Mai," he said. Not honey, not your home, just Mai. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. I was still holding the gold bracelet. He looked at the woman beside him, then looked at me. I didn't know you were coming. I tried to smile. To surprise you, I said, my voice small. To see our son. He looked at the child, then back at me, and I knew. In that flicker of hesitation, in the way his fingers moved behind his back, I knew I had lost something I couldn't get back. That night, I didn't sleep in my house. I slept at my aunt's place 3 blocks away. She looked at me with sad eyes, offered rice, and said, "You were gone too long, child. Life moves on." The next day, Fong came to see me. He didn't come with flowers or apologies. He came with an envelope. Inside was a divorce petition. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said. Things changed. Tuan barely knows you. And Thao's been helping me raise him. She's good to us. Thao. The woman who opened my gate. The one who called me Chi Mai in the past. The one who used to live 2 doors down and called me her idol. She was there, Fong said, when I was alone, when I thought you'd forgotten us. Forgotten? I pulled out my phone and opened the transfer app. Showed him every receipt. Every dollar. Every sacrifice. I didn't forget, I whispered. I just believed that everything I sent was for us. But Fong didn't meet my eyes. He just said, "I'll sign whatever you want. Just don't make this harder than it needs to be." Then he walked away. That night, I opened my suitcase and stared at the bracelet. I held it for a long time, wondering if Tuan would ever wear it. Wondering if he'd ever call me again with the same sparkle in his eyes. But I didn't cry. Not yet. Because a part of me The part that once sent love folded in every bank transfer wasn't dead. It was just beginning to burn. And from that fire, I would learn how to reborn. The call that changed everything 3 days after I landed, the gold bracelet was still in my bag. Untouched. Unworn. The woman he loved now, Thao, was still wearing my slippers in the kitchen, and my son Tuan still hadn't called me me. He avoided my eyes like a stranger too polite to ask why I kept staring. I stayed at my aunt's house. At night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the heat, but because of the silence. The kind of silence that comes when everything you believed in is shattered, and there's no one left to tell you. You were right to believe. Each morning, I'd stare at my reflection and wonder, was I the fool or just the forgotten? Then the call came. I was sitting by the window, phone in hand, scrolling through old photos of Tuan, back when he still had chubby cheeks and used to kiss the screen when I video called. My phone buzzed, a number I hadn't saved. I almost declined, but something made me answer. Hello, I said. Silence, then. Mai, is that you? The voice was familiar. Soft, gentle, with a slight tremble I hadn't heard in years. It's me, I replied. Who's this? It's Chi, the voice said. From Taichung. You used to work in the same hotel laundry room. Remember? Chi. I nearly dropped the phone. I hadn't heard that name since my second year abroad. She and I had folded sheets together at 2 a.m., shared bruised fruit for lunch, laughed over broken Chinese, and wept over husbands who stopped replying. We'd lost contact when she moved cities. I heard what happened, she said. I saw your post on that old Facebook group about coming home. She hesitated. I also saw what Tao posted. The pictures, with your son. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen them, but I didn't need to. I'm sorry, she said. I stayed silent. Then she added something that made me sit up straighter. But I think I can help. I blinked. Help? How? Chi took a deep breath. Remember how I told you my cousin in Vietnam started a small bookkeeping business? Well, she's not small anymore. She works with a legal aid organization now. They help women in cases like yours, especially workers from overseas who were exploited or abandoned. My throat tightened. You think they'll help me? I don't have anything left. They'll help because you gave everything, Chi said. You sent money from abroad. You have receipts, transfers, proof. And if that house was built with your earnings, you still have a claim. That word echoed in my ears. Claim. Not beg, not plead, but claim, as in, I have the right. I didn't sleep that night. I pulled out every receipt, every Viber message, every photo I sent of me in the hotel uniform, every video of me blowing kisses to Tuan through a cracked phone screen. I printed them all, laid them across the floor, like a shrine or a battlefield. The next morning, Chi called back. We can meet at 3 p.m., she said. My cousin will call you. Her name's Lynn. At 2:50 p.m., I stood outside a modest office in the back of a narrow alley. A faded sign read, To Van Fapli, Women's Legal Aid, TPHCM. Inside, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a calm voice invited me to sit. You're Mai? She asked. I nodded. You worked abroad for 6 years? Yes. And you transferred the money into an account under his name? Yes. And you didn't sign away any rights to the house? Never. I didn't even know it was built under his name. She paused, then looked at me straight in the eye. Then Mai, she said slowly, you've got a case. And not just in spirit, in law. Tears I didn't know I'd been holding spilled down my cheeks. You mean I can fight back? I whispered. You can, she said. And we'll help you, but it won't be easy. You'll be called selfish, ungrateful, even crazy, but you're none of those things. You're a woman who gave everything and is simply asking for what's rightfully hers. The next few days passed like thunder. We filed for legal mediation. Lynn drafted a statement for joint ownership of the house. She compiled my transfers, proof of employment, and all bank records. We also requested a court-appointed counselor to meet with Tuan, because even though I'd lost Fong, I wouldn't lose my son. Then came the message from Fong. No greeting, no apology. Just, why are you doing this? Tao is pregnant. Don't destroy what we've built. I stared at the screen. What we've built? I built it. I scrubbed bathrooms for it. I bled for it. I lost birthdays, New Year's Eves, and my own mother's funeral for it. All he did was move someone else in. I didn't reply. Instead, I sent the screenshot to Lynn. She added it to the case file. That night, she came to visit me. She brought a small box of dried mangoes and a faded photo of us in hotel uniforms, both making peace signs with tired eyes. I always believed in you, she said. You were the strongest of us all. No, I replied. I was just the last one to realize that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Before going to sleep, I opened my journal and wrote, Today I remembered who I am. I am not a victim. I am not invisible. And I am not done. The woman who called me sis. There was a time when she used to knock on my door just to borrow a spoon, or a hair curler, or to sit in my kitchen and tell me her dreams like I was her older sister. That was Tao. Back then, I saw her as the girl next door who needed guidance. She would help me fold clothes, carry groceries, and even played with baby Tuan when I was busy cooking. Chị Mai, sau này em chỉ mong được như chị, có gia đình, có chồng thương, có con ngoan. She used to say it with that sweet smile, eyes wide with admiration. And I believed her. I believed in the sisterhood we shared. The trust, the honesty, the illusion. Now she stood in the lawyer's office. Not with shame, not with remorse, but with the confidence of someone who thinks she's won. The day we summoned her for mediation, Lynn asked if I wanted to be present. I didn't even hesitate. Yes, I want her to see me. I want her to see what betrayal looks like when it refuses to break. When she walked into the room, her heels echoed across the floor. She wore a soft blue dress, familiar. It was mine. One of the few I left behind 6 years ago. She greeted Lynn with a nod, and when she turned to me, her face shifted. Not guilt, not surprise, but control. Chi Mai, she said, her voice gentle. Long time no see. I looked her in the eyes. Don't call me that, I said calmly. You gave up the right when you crawled into my house. She blinked. The room went still. I didn't crawl, she said slowly. I was asked to stay. You were asked to keep my child safe, not to replace me in his life. Thao sat down. She crossed her legs like she belonged there. You left, Chi. 6 years. Do you know how many birthdays Tuan cried himself to sleep? How many nights Fong came home exhausted, alone? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the audacity of her defense was so perfectly rehearsed. Don't talk to me about sacrifice, I snapped. I was cleaning toilets while you were warming my bed. Lynn stepped in. This isn't a debate, she said. We're here to address the legal claim Mrs. May is filing, specifically the assets built using her earnings sent over 6 years. Thao leaned back. I didn't touch her money. Fong handled all that. He used it to build a house you live in, Lynn said. A house she funded. Thao's smile faded. You can't prove that. We already did, Lynn said coolly. Bank transfers, messaging records, employment contracts from Taiwan. Even the contractor's invoice with dates matching the remittances. Thao's eyes narrowed. You don't understand, she whispered, almost to herself. He needed someone here. I was there. I kept the house alive, kept Tuan fed. Doesn't that count for something? I stood then, because this wasn't about legality anymore. This was about truth. You didn't keep the house alive, I said. You kept it warm while you erased my name from the door. You cooked in my kitchen, slept in my bed. You wore my clothes. And when my son asked who you were, you let him call you me. Her eyes welled up. You left, she whispered. I filled a space that was empty. It wasn't empty, I said coldly. It was waiting. The room fell silent. Then Lynn spoke again, professional and composed. Mrs. May is not contesting custody today, but she is submitting an official claim for partial ownership of the house and shop, as both were built and sustained through her financial contributions while abroad. Thao stared at the floor, hands trembling slightly. I could feel it. The shift, the beginning of her unraveling. She wasn't the innocent anymore. She was the intruder who thought I'd never come back. After the session, I stepped outside. The sky was gray, heavy with rain, but I felt lighter. I didn't win yet, but I had looked her in the eyes. I had taken my place back. That evening, I passed by the school where Tuan now studied. I watched from a distance as children ran out, laughing and wild. And there he was, my boy. He looked older now, but something in his posture, the tilt of his head, still belonged to me. I didn't call out. I didn't want to confuse him. Not yet. But I made a promise to myself. One day, he'll know everything. Not because I'll tell him, but because he'll see the kind of woman his mother became. When I returned to my aunt's, a package was waiting for me. Inside, a drawing from Tuan. Stick figures. One tall, one small, and a house. Above it, in shaky letters, it said, Home. There was no signature, no sender, but I knew it came from him. Maybe he didn't know who I was yet. But part of him still remembered something. Someone. That night I wrote, "She called me sis, then she took my name from my son's lips. But I am done whispering. I have fire and memory and time. The divorce papers in my luggage." The first time he held my hand, we were standing under a street lamp that flickered like it couldn't decide whether to shine. He smiled at me and said, "Even when everything else is unsure, I'll still be here." He lied. And now that lie was folded neatly in an envelope, with stamps, and my name typed in bold. Divorce. I didn't cry when I first read it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I was too tired to bleed again from the same wound. The envelope sat at the bottom of my luggage, under the gold bracelet. Next to the transfer receipts I thought were building a home. Funny, isn't it? How I packed memories and betrayal in the same suitcase. Lynn called the next morning. The legal paperwork was moving faster than expected. Fong, under pressure from the housing claim and growing social tension, had agreed to cooperate for a swift divorce. "He thinks you'll settle quickly," Lynn warned. "He's underestimating you. Again." I chuckled. "He always did." Then paused. And maybe I let him. The day we signed the papers, it rained. Of course it did. Even the sky seemed to want to wash him out of my life. We met at the notary office. No words, just nods. His hair looked neater than usual. He wore the watch I bought him our 3rd anniversary, the one I thought he'd lost. He didn't say sorry. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just looked at the documents like they were business contracts. He signed, then slid the pen toward me. I stared at it. Not the pen, the moment. It was more than ink on paper. It was an ending, and I had to decide. Would it be quiet? Or would I let it roar? I picked up the pen, wrote my name, slow, bold, then looked at him. "I loved you," I said, voice calm. "I worked 12-hour days in another country, sent every dollar home, trusted you to build our dream. And you sold it for convenience." He looked down. "I didn't ask for you to go," he said. "You didn't stop me either." I paused. "You didn't even wait." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I stood up. "You can keep the house," I said, "but you'll never sleep peacefully in it. Because every brick whispers my name." I walked out before he could reply. That night, I took the divorce papers out of my bag, held them under the single light bulb in my aunt's room. I didn't cry. Instead, I wrote on the back in pencil, "You gave me this paper to erase me, but I'll use it to rewrite myself." The next morning, I woke up at 5 a.m., made tea, sat outside, and started drafting a plan. Not for revenge, not for attention, but for rebirth. I went back to Lynn's office. "I want to start something," I told her. "A small shop, nothing big, but under my name. From my money, from my hands." Lynn smiled. "You're not just reclaiming a house," she said. "You're reclaiming you." With her help, I opened an account, filed a small business license, rented a tiny kiosk in the corner of the neighborhood market. I sold what I knew. Homemade snacks, dried fruits, and little gifts from Taiwan I had saved in boxes. I named it Mai's Corner. Not because I wanted attention, but because after years of giving everything, I wanted to claim something. Just mine. The community responded better than I expected. Old women who used to gossip about me suddenly came to buy mango slices and apologized with shy smiles. Young mothers asked if I could teach them how to make guabao. Some even whispered, "Chi mai, em thấy clip đó. Em không nghĩ chị mind đến vậy." Apparently the story had spread, not the full legal mess, but just enough to make people curious, to make them listen. One afternoon, as I was closing the kiosk, a small hand tugged at my ao dai. I turned. It was Tuan, holding the bracelet. His eyes were unsure, but his hand was steady. "This is mine, right?" he asked. I knelt down, heart shaking. "Yes," I whispered, "always has been." He leaned in, kissed my cheek, then ran off before I could say another word. I watched him go, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself cry. That night, I wrote in my journal, "I signed away a marriage today, but I kept everything that mattered. I kept my truth. I kept my name. I kept my fire. The house I built but can't enter." It still smelled like the soap I used to pack in boxes, the jasmine one. As I stood outside the gate, breeze brushing the loose hair behind my ears, I wondered if they even knew I was here. If they felt it. The way memories cling to walls. The way silence thickens when someone who belongs returns. But I didn't knock. Because this time, I wasn't here for them. I was here for me. The house looked the same. White paint. Red tile roof. The small garden I paid for with overtime hours and swollen ankles. The wind chime I mailed home from Taiwan still hung by the door. It chimed once, then stopped. Like even it didn't know how to greet me. I stepped closer. The gate wasn't locked, but I didn't push it. There's something about seeing your name erased that feels louder than any slam. The nameplate now read, Fong, Tao, Tuan. No space, no slash, no May. I sat on the low cement bench just outside the gate, the same one I sat on when I found out Tuan was going to kindergarten. Back then, I held my phone and cried because I couldn't afford the plane ticket home. Back then, I told myself, next year, Mai. Next year, you'll walk him to class yourself. But the next year came and went, and the years after that. And now, I was just a name missing from the mailbox. I don't know how long I sat there. Maybe 30 minutes, maybe 2 hours. I was about to leave when I heard the door creak open. Small footsteps, and then, Komai? I turned. It was Tuan, holding a school notebook and looking unsure. He didn't look scared or angry, just curious. Hi, I whispered. Are you studying well? He nodded. I have a math test tomorrow. I smiled. You were always good with numbers. He tilted his head. You remember? I nodded. I remember everything. He walked closer, sat on the other end of the bench. Why did you come? He asked. I hesitated. To remember what I built, I said, and to see what still stands. He looked at me. The house? I paused. No, you. For a long moment, we just sat there. Two people who once shared everything, blood, warmth, stories before bed, and now sat across years of silence. Then he reached into his bag, pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. A drawing. Stick figures again. A woman holding a boy's hand. Another figure stood further away, holding a phone. And behind them, a house. Who's that? I asked, pointing at the woman. He looked up. You. My heart stopped. And the one with the phone? Dad. I swallowed. And the one in the house? He was quiet, then said, She's just there. But I don't really draw her much. I wanted to cry. But I didn't. I just nodded, then slowly took out the gold bracelet, the one I still carried in my purse. Do you want this now? I asked. He reached for it, then hesitated. Can you put it on me? I smiled through tears I didn't let fall, slipped it onto his small wrist. It clicked into place like it had been waiting. The front door opened again. Fong stepped out. He saw us, stopped. His face was unreadable, but his fists were tight. Tuan, he said. My son stood, looked at me, then looked back at his father. I'll come in later, he said. And in that moment, I didn't need to enter the house, because what mattered most had just stepped out to meet me. Fong didn't say a word, but I stood and faced him. I'm not here to cause trouble, I said. I'm not here to fight, just to remind you both that I exist, and that this house, every tile, every step, still carries my story. He looked away. You already took what you wanted, he muttered. No, I replied, I took what you couldn't break. I turned to Tuan. Good luck on your test, I said softly. He nodded, then ran to the gate, opened it from the inside, and whispered, Mai's corner still has those mango candies? I smiled. Always. As I walked away, I felt something shift. Not around me, but inside. I didn't need the house. I didn't need the title. I didn't need the door to open, because I had just reclaimed everything that was mine. My son's trust, my dignity, myself. That night, I returned to my little room above the kiosk, taped Tuan's drawing to the wall, and wrote, I once believed I needed 4 walls to feel whole, but I've learned that wholeness comes from within. And sometimes the home you build for others becomes the fire that builds you. The day my son didn't recognize me. There are heartbreaks that come from betrayal. There are heartbreaks that come from lies. And then there's the heartbreak of seeing your child, your own flesh and blood, look into your eyes and ask, who are you? It happened the day I visited Tuan's school. I wasn't trying to cause drama. I didn't come with demands or anger. I came with a lunchbox, warm rice, fried egg, and the pork floss he used to love as a toddler. I remembered how he would hold the spoon with both hands and giggle when I made little rice balls. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd still remember too. The security guard was kind. Cô là mẹ của em Tuấn? I nodded. Cháu quên hộp cơm sáng ở nhà. Tôi muốn gửi lại. He smiled gently. Lát nữa cháu xuống lấy. I waited behind a row of potted plants near the school entrance, just for a glimpse, just to see him run out, to see his face light up, to know there was still a string tying him back to me. But when Tuan came out, holding the lunchbox, he looked around and walked right past me. I called out softly, Tuan? He stopped, turned. Our eyes met. I smiled. But instead of smiling back, he looked at me, confused, polite, like I was a teacher or a neighbor. Then he asked the question that broke me in half. Ko la aya? I couldn't breathe. I stood there frozen, the smile still on my lips but cracking. I'm I'm just someone who made you lunch, I managed to say. And he nodded. Da, kung kamen. Then turned and walked back to class, like I was nobody. Like I had never held him to my chest, whispered lullabies into his ear, or cried alone in a foreign country just for the chance to feed him one more time. I walked away before the tears came. Fast. Like running would erase what had just happened. But I couldn't outrun the echo of his voice. Ko la aya? That night, I didn't speak to anyone. Not even Chai, not even my aunt. I sat in my room, staring at the bracelet now empty on the desk, the one he once asked me to put on. Did he forget me already? Did Tao replace me that completely? Was I gone too long? Then I remembered something Lynn had told me. Children don't forget love, they forget faces, voices, timelines. But the heart remembers. So I made a decision. Not to beg, not to force, but to rebuild. The next morning, I started a new notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Letters to Tuan until he remembers." And every day after that, I wrote him a letter. Some short, some long. Some filled with stories of when he was little. Some filled with pain I couldn't say aloud. Dear Tuan, you used to call the moon the night sun. You were 3, and I remember laughing so hard I cried. But maybe I laughed so hard because I missed you even then. Dear Tuan, your favorite food was always mango dipped in chili salt. I used to sneak some into your lunch when Dad said no. I wonder if she knows that. Dear Tuan, the first word you ever said wasn't ba, it was ma. And you pointed at me like I was the only thing that made sense. I wrote every day for 3 weeks. Then I placed the first 5 letters into a small envelope and gave them to Chai. Can you just leave these somewhere he might find them? She nodded. She won't let him read them if she knows they're from you. I know, I said, but maybe one day, curiosity will beat silence. And it did. On the 4th week, Tuan came to my kiosk alone. No Tao, no Fong, just him. He didn't say much. Just stood there holding a folded letter in his hand. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't say he missed me. He just said, "Cô viết cái này hả?" I nodded. Every word. He looked at me. Long and hard. Then asked, "Con có thể ngồi ở đây đọc tiếp không?" I pulled out a chair. He sat and read. Silently, carefully, pausing only to whisper, "Con nhớ cái này nè. Ma hay kế hỏi con nhớ." He said ma, not ko, not chi. Ma. It was barely a whisper, barely a breath. But it was mine. And suddenly I didn't feel forgotten. That night I didn't write a letter. I didn't need to. Instead, I wrote in my journal, "He forgot my face, but not my love. And in the end, love is the only name that matters. The truth behind their lies. There's forgetting. And then there's being taught to forget." Tuan didn't just stop remembering me on his own. He was led away from my memory, one small step at a time, like someone gently closing a door, until the room you used to live in becomes just a shadow. It started with a single sentence. Tuan came to my kiosk again that afternoon. Same time, same quiet steps, but this time he held not a letter, but a question. "Ma, có bố con không?" I froze. He said it so softly, like he wasn't even sure what he was asking. But my heart knew. "What do you mean, Tuan?" I asked, kneeling beside him. He looked at his shoes, kicked a pebble. "Ba nói, má không chịu về. Má chọn sống xa, chọn không gặp con." Every word hit like glass. I wanted to scream. Unbi, to find Fong, to shake Thao, but instead I breathed and said as gently as I could, "Con yêu, má không chọn rồi con. Má chọn làm việc, để con có nhà, để con được đi học, để ba không phải vất vả. Má đã gửi tất cả về từng đồng." Tuan looked up, eyes wide. "Nhưng má không gọi." I bit my lip. "Má gọi nhiều lần nhưng sau đó, ba không bắt máy nữa. Má không biết chuyện gì xảy ra." Silence. Tuan blinked slowly. "Thảo nói, má lấy chồng khác rồi." The air left my lungs. I shook my head. "No, Tuan, má chưa từng yêu ai khác ngoài con. Má chưa từng có ai ngoài gia đình mình." His hands trembled. "Má ơi, sao ba nói vậy?" That was the moment. The moment I realized this wasn't just abandonment in Tuan's eyes. This was betrayal, from me. Because the people he trusted most told him I left, told him I forgot, told him I moved on. And the worst part? He believed it. Because he was just a child. That night, I met Lynn at the legal office. "I want to revise the custody agreement," I said firmly. Lynn looked up. "Are you sure? That will escalate things." I nodded. "They can take my house, they can take my marriage, but they cannot raise my child on lies. We filed the motion, requested mediation. Fong responded with a fury I hadn't seen before. He called me. Not a message, not an email, a full phone call. "Are you trying to ruin what's left of our family?" He spat. "Tuan's happy. Don't confuse him." "He's confused already," I snapped. "Because of you. You were gone. What else was I supposed to tell him? The truth. That's what. That I left for him. That I worked for him. That I cried for him." But Fong didn't want truth. He wanted convenience. He wanted Thao to slide into a role without guilt or resistance. So instead of answering, I said, "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm asking the court." The day of the hearing, Tuan wasn't present. But I was. And so was Tao. She wore white again. How fitting. Innocence as a costume. She gave her statement first. "Tuan is settled. He's adjusted. I've raised him for years now. Changing anything now would only cause harm." I stood next. "My son isn't adjusted. He's misled. He doesn't know his own history because you erased it." I paused. "He believes I left him for another man. He believes I chose distance over love. He believes I didn't try." My voice broke, but I didn't cry. I tried. Every day. With every cent I sent. With every call that wasn't picked up. With every photo he never saw. I looked the judge in the eye. "I am not asking for full custody. I'm asking for the right to tell my story so my son can choose who I really am." The judge nodded. A visitation schedule was ordered, supervised at first, but official. I didn't win back his full life, but I won time. Time to rebuild. Time to be heard. Time to be his mother again. Later that week, Tuan came to visit my kiosk under the supervision of a social worker. He was nervous. So I didn't ask him questions, I just gave him a notebook. "I used to write letters to you," I said. "Now, maybe you can write some back." He opened the first page, drew a sun, then wrote, "Con không biết mà, nhưng con muốn biết." That night I wrote in my journal. They tried to rewrite me with silence, with lies. But truth always leaves footprints, and my son that is starting to follow them. The night I slept on a bench. It wasn't just a bench, it was cold metal, half rusted, sitting under a tree whose branches looked like they hadn't held leaves in years. A bench near the back of the market where the streetlight flickered like it was too tired to shine steadily. That night I slept there. Not because I wanted to, but because I had nowhere else to go. A week before, my aunt fell seriously ill. She was taken in by her daughter, my cousin, who lived in another province. There was no space for me. And 2 days before that, the kiosk I rented, Mai's Corner, was shut down. A sudden inspection, anonymous complaints. No permits found, they said, but I knew who it was. Fong had threatened to make things harder after the court granted me visitation rights. He didn't take kindly to losing control. I spent that day walking. No kiosk, no home, no husband, no comfort. But oddly enough, I didn't feel sorry for myself. Not anymore. Instead, I sat on that bench, held my bag close to my chest, and thought about all the other nights I had slept alone in Taiwan. Not because I was abandoned, but because I had a reason to keep going. A soft drizzle started around midnight. It clung to my cheeks like cold hands. I pulled my thin jacket tighter. I didn't sleep. I just closed my eyes and waited. Waited for morning. Waited for something to change. But what changed wasn't the world. It was me. Around 5 a.m., an old lady sweeping the market walked by. She stopped. "Cô gái, sao lại ngủ ở đây?" I smiled weakly. "Con đang nghỉ một chút thôi à?" She stared, then quietly took off her scarf and wrapped it around my shoulders. "You remind me of my daughter," she said. She was strong too, but she forgot to ask for help. And then she added, "Don't forget, strong people also need somewhere to rest." After she left, I stood up, dust on my back, leaves in my hair, but head held high. I had rested. Now I would rise. I called Lynn. "I want to start again," I told her. "But this time I want to register everything, legal, official, mine." Lynn didn't hesitate. "We'll get the license. We'll name it whatever you want." I paused, then said, "Call it the bench." 2 weeks later, the bench Homemade Comfort opened on a quiet corner of a street not far from Tuan's school. It wasn't fancy. Just a small cafe cart with 3 folding chairs. But every dish had a story, every bowl had meaning. Locals came out of curiosity, but they returned for the feeling. Because it didn't just taste like food, it tasted like home. One afternoon, Tuan came again. He sat on the real bench next to the cart. "I told my teacher that my ma sells food here," he said proudly. "She said she wants to try." I smiled. "She's welcome anytime." Then he pulled out a drawing, another stick figure sketch. But this one was different. It had two mothers, one on each side of him. I stared, heart pounding. Duan explained, "This is Mamai, and this is Mệt Thao. Con nghĩ con có thể yêu cả hai, nhưng Mamai là người con giống nhất." I didn't speak. I just reached out and hugged him. Tight. That night, I didn't sleep on a bench. I didn't sleep in a borrowed room. I slept on a mat beside my cart under a string of fairy lights, with a small notebook tucked under my pillow. The title written by Tuan. My mother's letters. In the morning, I wrote the final entry in my journal. He left me with a suitcase full of loss, but I unpacked it and found strength. I lost a marriage, but I found my voice. I slept on a bench, but I woke up on a path of my own. I am Mai. And I didn't just survive. I began again. Some people leave scars, others leave lessons. Burn and reborn stories that break you, then rebuild you.